The galaxy has always whispered of ruin, but when the name of TZEEENTCH coils its way into those whispers, the words twist and warp until they no longer resemble truth at all. His influence does not descend like a hammer blow, nor burn like the firestorms of other ruinous powers. It creeps, it coils, it rearranges reality in patterns unseen, until a world is not destroyed but rewritten. What does it mean when an entire planet becomes a canvas for a god of change? What does it mean when history itself buckles, and certainty is no longer possible? This is not annihilation. This is transformation beyond recognition. To fall to TZEENTCH is to lose more than life. It is to lose meaning, and once that meaning unravels, there is no thread that can be rewoven. If you are drawn into stories of worlds consumed by war, faith, and the endless struggle of the Imperium against the powers that would undo it, join us as we descend into this tale. Like, share, and subscribe to ensure that the next story finds you when the Astronomicon itself feels most distant. The warp is vast, and every voice matters. The first signs were never fire or thunder. They came instead like a shadow in daylight, a flicker across the edges of the sky that no one could describe clearly afterward. At first the shimmer was dismissed as atmospheric disturbance, a trick of heat rising from the manufactorious chimneys or the aurora born of solar winds. Yet men and women stopped mid-step when they saw it. Even the most hardened veterans of the Astra Militarum found their breath catch, unable to explain why a subtle gleam above the horizon felt like the beginning of something that would not end. In those days the city still functioned. Bells rang across the Ecclesiarchy's shrines. Data slates hummed with supply reports, and children carried water through the avenues. Yet, underneath it all, the air carried a weight no wind could disperse. The first recorded instance was not a battle report, but a scrap of parchment, discovered nailed to the door of a habla. The words it bore were simple: "You have already spoken this prayer." The residents swore none had written it, and no vox capture caught the hand that placed it. Priests burned it in the name of the Emperor, declaring it the work of agitators. Yet hours later, copies appeared again, identical down to every stroke of ink. Civilians whispered that they must have seen the parchment before, though none could recall when. For the first time, certainty trembled. It was not the sound of war, but the breaking of trust in one's own memory. In the barracks of the Astra Militarum, soldiers awoke to the sound of comrades speaking with unfamiliar voices. One guardsman rose from his bunk and recited, in perfect High Gothic, a litany of the Adeptus Mechanicus he had never studied. Another gave orders in a tone identical to his sergeant's, even as the sergeant himself listened in horror. At first they were restrained, examined, and purged of supposed heresy, but more followed. The commissariat executed men for words they claimed never to have spoken, and yet those same words returned in the mouths of others. Soon no one trusted the sound of their brother's voice. The barracks grew quieter, not with peace, but with the fear of speaking at all. The Ecclesiarchy tried to answer. Sermons were lengthened, incense burned thicker, hymns chanted until voices cracked. Priests declared that the shimmer in the sky was a test of faith, a veil placed by the Emperor to strengthen his servants. But behind closed doors, even confessors admitted unease. Holy texts on data slates rearranged their verses when reopened, lines appearing in sequences that had never been sanctioned. When one bishop attempted to read the Imperial Creed aloud, his tongue twisted the words into patterns no one had written. The congregation bowed their heads and pretended they heard truth, but afterward they could not repeat what had been spoken. Faith did not vanish. It bent under the strain, reshaped into doubt. Civilians noticed smaller fractures, intimate terrors that could not be explained away as rebellion or malfunction. A mother awoke to find her child's eyes reflecting constellations that did not exist. Merchants at the market swore their coin counts changed between blinks, as though the Emperor himself demanded tribute no one had given. Laborers in the manufactoria found themselves standing before machines they had no memory of building, their own work unfamiliar to their hands. Fear spread not because demons walked the streets, but because the streets themselves began to whisper of a world no longer loyal to the laws of time and flesh at night. The shimmer above the sky thickened into threads of faint blue light, tracing lines like cracks in glass. When watched too long, the constellations seemed to bend, rearranging themselves into new patterns, sometimes spelling words no astronomer dared to record. Vox operators reported feedback that formed coherent phrases, instructions in languages unknown, yet strangely familiar. Some officers destroyed the devices, believing them corrupted by the warp. Others listened, and those who listened began to act differently, carrying an expression of quiet certainty, even as the rest of the city trembled. Their calm frightened the populace more than hysteria ever could. The Astra Militarum tried to impose order. Patrols doubled, checkpoints were erected, and every rumor was treated as subversion. Yet even the chain of command began to twist. Orders issued by captains were recorded differently in the cogitators. A command to secure a perimeter would appear as an order to abandon it. A requisition for promethium became, on delivery, a stockpile of incense. Data slates bore the Imperial Aquila one moment, and the next a spiral no one recognized. Soldiers marched where they were told, yet always found themselves somewhere unintended. Entire platoons vanished into corridors of the hive, later discovered still patrolling. But in districts that had not existed the day before, fear became hunger. Not hunger for food. The administratum still rationed grain and protein, but hunger for certainty. Families prayed to the emperor for a single night's sleep without whispered voices. Officers begged the mechanicus for machines that obeyed their purpose. Priests sought words that would not shift beneath their tongues. What they received instead were rumors of cults gathering in sewers, of masks worn by those who no longer remembered their own faces, of voices promising that none of this was accident, that change was not punishment, but gift. In such whispers the first seeds of devotion were sown, not to the emperor, but to the changer of ways. The chapter of survival no longer belonged to the physical. No one starved, no one froze, but truth itself had become the rarest resource. Every man and woman learned to question not the heretic at the gates, but the reflection in their own eyes. Could they trust the ground beneath their boots? Could they trust their own hands? Each dawn brought with it not the promise of routine, but the certainty of another fracture, another reminder that reality was no longer loyal. And though the shimmer in the sky had not yet torn open, though no demon yet walked among them, the world was already falling, not to fire, not to steel, but to the intimate unraveling of meaning itself. The first cracks in command were small, subtle enough that a loyal officer could explain them away. A governor's decree would leave the Vox stations carrying one set of words. Yet the scribes who transcribed it onto parchment recorded another. At first, this was seen as incompetence. Punishments were meted out. Scribes flogged, Vox technicians executed for suspected sabotage, but executions multiplied, and the errors persisted. The words themselves were changing, not the men. What began as clerical error became recognized as something else, something no order, no punishment could halt. Generals found their maps unreliable. Territories shifted as though the land itself had taken new oaths. One campaign log recorded a regiment advancing north toward a refinery, but when reviewed a day later, the parchment insisted the regiment had moved east toward a cathedral. The officers themselves swore they had followed orders correctly, and indeed, they had marched and fought as commanded, but the records showed otherwise. Attempts to reissue orders only made matters worse. The chain of command began to knot upon itself. Commanders issuing clarifications that birthed further contradictions, until whole battalions found themselves standing in silence, waiting for instructions that no longer meant anything at all. The governor's palace became a fortress of uncertainty. Servants carried proclamations through its halls, only for them to change a decree demanding tighter ration control, transformed into a promise of abundance by the time it reached the lower levels. Guards enforcing curfews were accused of overreach when the very documents they swore to obey no longer bore the words they remembered. Civilians, confused and terrified, began accusing one another of fabricating orders. Crowds gathered at shrines, demanding clarity from priests, but the Ecclesiarchy faltered too. Sermons written in the morning refused to match the scrolls in the evening. Prelates discovered their own handwriting had shifted, sentences spelling out doctrines they had never sworn to. Some continued to preach as though nothing was amiss, their voices breaking, but others fell into silence, clutching rosaries of bone and whispering prayers that no longer carried conviction. The Astra Militarum struggled hardest against the fracture. Commissars enforced discipline with brutality, executing soldiers who questioned commands, yet doubt spread faster than bullets. A platoon ordered to hold a bridge found themselves accused of desertion when records now showed they had been tasked to abandon it. Supply officers opened crates of ammunition that, by every data slate record, should have been medical kits. The skittery detachments brought to stabilize Manufactoria grew silent when their schematics refused to match the machines around them, and some simply walked away, their metallic feet echoing down corridors until no one could say where they had gone. The certainty of command, once the spine of imperial order, was corroding into 1,000 shards of contradiction. The claustrophobia of these days was not born from battlefields, but from the corridors of power themselves. Generals stared at their maps until their eyes bled, desperate to pin down even a single unchanging landmark. Governors demanded loyalty from aides whose faces seemed less familiar each passing day. Priests locked themselves in archives, tearing through parchment to find a line of liturgy that had not shifted overnight. When clarity could not be found, fear swelled. Fear that perhaps loyalty itself was being rewritten. Fear that the Emperor's will, once a shining beacon, was flickering under a shadow no one could name aloud. Rumors infected the ranks as swiftly as the fractures themselves. Some claimed an invisible hand rewrote orders to test obedience, a divine trial in which true loyalty meant following command even when it contradicted itself. Others whispered that the Emperor had abandoned them, leaving their world adrift in a sea of voices. The most dangerous were those who spoke with certainty. Officers who declared they alone could interpret the true meaning of commands began to gather followers. Priests who claimed that changing texts were prophecy filled their shrines with desperate souls. The chain of command did not merely corrode, it splintered into rival hierarchies, each claiming authority, each convinced the others were heretical. The governor's council fractured entirely. Ministers argued, not over policy, but over whether their words were still their own. One counselor was accused of conspiracy when his speech, transcribed by 3 scribes, bore 3 different meanings. Another attempted suicide after realizing his own signature shifted from document to document, as though even his name no longer belonged to him. Attempts to restore unity through purges only hastened collapse. Executions emptied halls, but no amount of bloodshed could pin words to their intended meanings. The chain of command was no longer a chain at all, it was a mirror shattered into shards, each reflecting a different truth. Despair set in not when the first contradictions appeared, but when men and women realized they could not trust themselves. A captain issued orders with iron confidence, then stared in horror when the written copies bore lines he swore had never left his lips. A priest recited the creed with all his heart, yet his flock swore he had called them to worship something else entirely. And in those moments, despair grew heavier than fear, for what could be fought if even one's own voice was not loyal? The collapse was not an explosion, but a suffocation. It spread through the palace, the barracks, the shrines, until no one could breathe without doubt. Every word, every map, every oath, corroded under the weight of change. There were still no demons in the streets, no monstrous armies at the gates. Yet the world was already lost in ways fire could never achieve. Order, the Imperium's great promise, had unraveled, and in the silence left behind, something else was waiting. Something that thrived not in fire or destruction, but in the certainty that there would never again be certainty. They first appeared in shadows, gathering in corners no one thought worth watching. Men and women who had once prayed openly to the Emperor now whispered their litanies into strange patterns, as if the words themselves had begun to taste different on the tongue. The alleys behind shrines filled with quiet congregations, where candles burned in spirals instead of rows and masks made of parchment and wire-covered trembling faces. These cults did not name themselves heretical. They claimed salvation lay not in fighting the change, but in embracing it. To them, the shifting of words, the bending of maps, the vanishing of familiar faces were not curses, but signs. Proof that their world had been chosen for transformation. They promised their followers freedom from fear not by restoring order, but by discarding it. The commissariat recognized the danger, but even their brutal discipline faltered in these times. Soldiers dragged civilians into squares, demanding names and allegiances, but found themselves staring into faces that smiled with calm certainty. When accused of heresy, they offered no denial. Only words that seemed to slip past the ear and lodge in the mind, phrases that returned in dreams. Commissars executed these men and women on the spot. Yet the calmness with which they died spread more fear than rebellion ever had. Worse still were those in uniform. Guardsmen who one day obeyed orders and the next day spoke with a quiet, knowing tone, as if they had glimpsed a truth too vast to be hidden. More than once, a commissar found his own aide staring at him with that same smile. To hesitate was to risk contagion. To act was to kill men who had served loyally only days before. Suspicion became the only currency left. In barracks and manufactoria alike, men and women watched one another more than the tasks before them. A misplaced word, a smile too broad, a glance that lingered too long, all were grounds for accusation. Brothers turned on brothers, wives on husbands, units on their own officers. In some districts, purges consumed more lives than open violence. Streets ran red not because of demons, but because every neighbor was a potential mask for something unseen. The city's heart did not explode into chaos. It bled slowly, drained by paranoia. The manufactoria echoed with its own terrors. Skittery detachments, summoned to stabilize failing systems, reported corridors no longer matching their schematics. What had once been a cooling chamber became a stairwell. Storage rooms opened into halls lined with mirrors. Some detachments transmitted last reports describing labyrinths where machines hummed with no visible power source. Then they fell silent. Their fellows searched and found nothing. No corpses, no damage, only corridors that no longer lead where they should. Whispers spread that the skittery had not perished, but had been absorbed into the fabric of the manufactoria itself. Their metal feet now pacing unseen beneath the walls. Tech priests denied such heresy, but none could explain the silence. And even their prayers to the Omnissiah seemed to stutter when repeated cults fed on this. They promised answers to those who had none. To the worker who found his machine altered beyond recognition, they offered meaning. To the soldier who doubted his own orders, they offered purpose. To the widow who watched her child's eyes glow faintly in the dark, they offered hope. And always, their message was the same. The world was not collapsing. It was being remade. To resist was madness. To accept was salvation. They wore masks not only to hide their identities, but to show that identity itself was no longer fixed. They whispered that every face was temporary, every soul a shifting piece of something greater. But not all were seduced by gentle words. Some resisted in fire and rage. Commissars grew harsher, executing entire squads to root out a single suspected heretic. priests called for purges that consumed entire hablocks. Their sermons no longer filled with the warmth of faith, but the shrill edge of panic. The Astra Militarum responded with iron discipline, but even they cracked. In one regiment, half the officers turned their guns on the other half, each swearing they were the true loyalists. When the smoke cleared, only corpses remained, their faces twisted into expressions no living man could name. The collapse of community was not sudden. It was the slow realization that trust itself had become impossible. A man might kneel beside you in prayer one day and whisper blasphemy the next, convinced it was the Emperor's will. A sergeant might lead you faithfully for weeks, only to smile one night with eyes that reflected a sky no longer present. Every gesture, every word, every silence was suspect. The city became a mask of itself, its streets filled with people who no longer knew if they were playing roles or revealing their true selves. Perhaps both, and beneath it all, the sense grew that cleverness itself was a trap. Those who thought themselves immune, who mocked the cults, who swore their loyalty louder than all others, these were the ones who fell fastest. They began to speak in riddles, to laugh at orders, to claim that they alone understood the Emperor's true will. When confronted, they accused others of blindness, of weakness, of failing to see the patterns hidden in the fractures. In their arrogance, they became the most devoted servants of the change, though they never named it as such. They believed themselves resistant, even as they served. The faces behind the masks were not strangers. They were neighbors, comrades, kin. They were not possessed by demons, nor consumed by fire. They were transformed by belief, by the insidious comfort of certainty, in a world that had lost all meaning. That was the true power of the changer of ways, not the sudden storm, but the patient rearrangement of lives until no one could say where loyalty ended and heresy began. The human cost was not measured in battles lost, but in the collapse of every bond that once held community together. And as more faces smiled with that unsettling calm, the city itself seemed to grin, as though it too had donned a mask and joined the congregation. The first true sign that the world itself had betrayed its people came not in fire, but in the sky. What had once been a familiar canopy of stars split open as though glass had fractured across the heavens. Constellations rearranged themselves between blinks, entire clusters of light flickering into new patterns that no chart could recognize. Navigators and astronomers wept at their instruments, unable to lock even the most basic coordinates, while ordinary citizens stood in the streets staring upward with open mouths. Some fell to their knees in prayer, others screamed and tore their hair, and still more simply laughed as if clarity had finally come. The firmament, once the measure of order and constancy, had become a shifting puzzle, daring any who looked upon it to find meaning. Storms followed, not the rains of water or ash that a city could endure, but vast coils of raw warp lightning that tore through the atmosphere, leaving rivers of color seared into the sky. Spires that had reached proudly for centuries were bent like reeds, their foundations twisting under unseen pressure. Whole manufactoria floated free of gravity, groaning as their bulk hovered above the ground, casting shadows that stretched and warped across districts below. Civilians fled in panic only to find themselves trapped as streets bent back upon themselves, alleys swallowing men who never re-emerged. The very architecture of survival roofs, walls, doors became treacherous, reshaping at the whim of patterns no mind could predict. Then the cities began to vanish. It was not destruction as the Imperium knew it. No bombardment, no collapse of stone, no firestorm. Instead, the streets blurred, their edges softening until they melted into corridors of translucent glass. Towers bent into spirals of reflection. Endless halls where men and women caught sight of themselves from angles no mirror could produce. In these labyrinths, screams carried forever, echoing through reflections until no one could find their source. Families wandered together only to realize each had taken a separate path. meeting their own faces at intersections and begging their reflections for guidance. Generals who entered with regiments emerged alone, their eyes blank, unable to describe what they had seen beyond corridors filled with infinite selves. Those cities were never reclaimed. They remained prisms on the horizon, glittering like jewels in daylight. Cages of living glass. Rumors spread faster than troops could march. Bishops confessed to hearing voices in their sleep, soft tones that promised victory if only they would submit to the new order. Generals awoke with battle strategies already written into their minds. Schemes that seemed flawless until carried out, at which point they shifted into disasters. Officers began to believe themselves chosen, elevated by whispers none could verify. Their men followed them with a mixture of awe and terror, convinced their leaders now bore insight too vast for ordinary minds. Yet those same leaders often vanished at dawn, their command posts found empty, their banners left to drift in winds that smelled faintly of ozone and blood. Faith did not die all at once. The Ecclesiarchy fought with hymns and relics, filling the streets with processions, their incense thick enough to choke lungs. But the sky mocked them. Warp lightning struck shrines, igniting holy texts that burned without smoke. Processions found themselves circling endlessly through streets that bent into loops, their chants unraveling into laughter that none admitted was their own. Some priests declared these trials a final test of loyalty. Others fell silent, clutching relics to their chests while their eyes flickered with reflections of constellations no one else could see. The Emperor's name still echoed through the streets, but it grew thin, strained, as though it were a memory spoken rather than a living creed. The intoxication of possibility spread like a plague. Cults no longer hid in alleys. They stood openly beneath the shattered sky, their masks lifted, their eyes reflecting patterns that shifted faster than the stars. They promised that the world was not ending but becoming, that every fracture was proof of ascension. Ordinary men and women, broken by fear, found in their words a strange comfort. Better to believe they were chosen for transformation than abandoned to madness. In their gatherings, voices rose in harmony, not shrieking, but calm and clear, as though they sang the world itself into its new shape. Each word they spoke bent reality a fraction further. Each ritual turned walls translucent, each prayer drew the lightning closer, and in the intoxication of such possibility, even despair felt like clarity. The Astra Militarum tried to hold the line, though there was no enemy to face. Platoons were stationed at the edges of glass cities, their lasguns trained on reflections that never stopped moving. Others fired into the sky, as though bolts of light could restore constellations. But men grew weary, not from battle, but from the knowledge that their war had no front, no objective, no end. A soldier could march an entire night, only to return to his starting point, footsteps circling a planet that no longer obeyed its own laws. To fight in such conditions was to fight not an enemy, but the collapse of reality itself. And even the most disciplined warriors could not sustain faith in such a war. What remained was not conquest, but corruption. A world caught in a net of patterns, too vast for any mind to hold. The heavens no longer offered certainty. The ground no longer held weight. The walls no longer gave shelter. Everything had become reflection, suggestion, possibility, and the people, stripped of trust, stripped of faith, stripped of meaning, became eager to follow anyone who spoke with certainty, even if that certainty came from the whispers of a god who laughed at their desperation. The planet no longer resembled what it had been. It had become a mirror held by the changer of ways, reflecting not what it was, but what it might yet become. The galaxy does not weep for every world it loses. Some are erased cleanly, their ruins marked upon star charts, their names preserved in administrative archives as reminders of vigilance and sacrifice. But the legacy of worlds touched by TZEENTCH is stranger, harder to trace, as though the very memory of them resists being pinned down. Survivors whisper of systems where a planet once orbited, only for the void to gape empty. Its existence stripped not just from sight, but from record. Data slates return errors when queried. Star maps display nothing but blank coordinates. It is as if the galaxy itself has forgotten that such a world ever bore the imperial Aquila. Yet those who escaped carry the memories still, though their testimonies are fragmented, contradictory, and often dismissed as madness. Among pilgrims, there are darker tales. They claim to have heard sermons echoing through voidship, sermons that carried no human voice, only a cadence of laughter stretched into something vast, terrible, and triumphant. These sermons speak not of the emperor, nor the imperial creed, but of patterns unfolding endlessly, of promises that reality itself can be remade if only one accepts the design. Some swear the laughter follows them, even into prayer, twisting holy words into new shapes, until they no longer know whether they are praising the god Emperor or something that watches from the warp. Ecclesiarchs deny such accounts, branding them the fabrications of heretics. Yet the unease lingers, passed in whispers between the faithful, who fear that perhaps the warp's hand can still reach them long after they have fled. Others believe that the planets do not vanish entirely, but drift forever at the edge of the warp, caught like shards of broken glass in a current no one can navigate. Rogue traders whisper of stumbling upon fragments of such worlds' continents, floating unmoored in a sea of shifting light, where the ruins of cathedrals hang upside down above oceans of glass, and manufactoria churn endlessly without fuel. These fragments defy logic, existing without gravity, without orbit, without law, as though they are echoes of the original world rather than matter itself. Few who claim to have seen them live long after, and those who do often find their memories shifting, their recollections bending as if the experience itself resists being told. The Adeptus Mechanicus has its own records, though few are ever seen outside sealed vaults. They speak of machines recovered from the edges of such anomalies, engines that hum in languages no tech priest can decipher, mechanisms that produce nothing but mirrored reflections of their operators, tools that rebuild themselves into shapes unrecognizable after each use. Some whisper that these fragments are not wreckage but experiments, left behind deliberately as offerings to the changer of ways. The Omnissiah's servants deny such speculation, but the very fact that these relics cannot be destroyed only locked Aewades to the sense that what TZEENTCH leaves behind is never mere ruin, but seeds waiting for unknown seasons. For the Astra Militarum, the legacy is heavier still. Veterans who survive such campaigns often carry scars that no Medicae can name. They speak of dreams where the constellations shift each night, of voices that echo their own commands back at them with slight, mocking alterations. Some never trust orders again, no matter how loyal, for they fear the words themselves may betray them. Regiments that fought on such worlds are rarely redeployed intact. More often they are broken apart, scattered across the galaxy, as though the Administratum itself fears the infection of memory, the possibility that an entire army could become a mask for something greater. Their banners vanish from the rolls, their names erased, their victories and defeats alike forgotten. It is not extermination. It is unmaking. And yet, for all this, the legacy is not despair alone. Some whisper that even in the echoes of unmaking, fragments of truth remain. Pilgrims who claim to have walked through glass labyrinths and returned speak of glimpses. They cannot forget visions of futures where humanity endures, where the Emperor rises renewed, where the chains of entropy are broken. They admit these may be illusions, tricks of the warp meant to seduce, but the memory lingers nonetheless, a splinter of hope carved from the very god who thrives on deception. Such ambiguity is perhaps the cruelest legacy of all, that even in ruin, the survivors cannot know whether they were cursed or blessed, deceived or enlightened, doomed or chosen. When a world falls to fire, its bones remain. When it falls to hunger, its graves endure. But when it falls to the changer of ways, What remains is not ruin but an echo, one that drifts, unsettled, unclaimed, persisting long after stone and flesh have been erased. These echoes infect memory, faith, and record alike, haunting not the soil of a planet, but the very idea of permanence. It is said in whispers that TZEENTCH does not crave worship alone, but remembrance, that every forgotten world, every erased name, every survivor who doubts his own testimony feeds the great design more fully than armies ever could. For in doubt lies possibility, and in possibility lies his dominion. Thus, the legacy of unmaking is not silence, nor death, nor conquest. It is the persistence of uncertainty, a wound that will not close, an echo that lingers longer than fortresses, shrines, or even stars. And in that echo, the galaxy is reminded that no truth is eternal, no map unchanging, no oath beyond fracture. Worlds may fall, yet their reflections remain forever shifting, forever mocking, forever whispering in the laughter of the warp.